I'm Shyam Gopalakrishnan. I work at the University of Copenhagen at the Globe Institute, and today I'm going to talk to you about admixture and canid evolution. And when I first thought about which stories I should present when we talk about canid evolution and admixture, I couldn't settle on one story, so I'm going to tell you four, which does mean about 15 minutes into the talk, I'll realize I don't have time, so I will start speaking faster. Right? So if I do that, do feel free to ask me to slow down. Okay, so in my lab, we do a bunch of work, and most of the work is focused on canids. We don't particularly work on dogs. There are lots of people work on dogs and dog domestication, but we are interested more in the role of admixture in the evolution of some of the other canids, some of the ones that you've definitely seen, not so much maybe in Europe, but they're making a comeback here. So it's time for us to better understand how these canids are related to each other and what their genomics tells us about how they're spreading across the continent. So there are two things that I'm going to talk about today. The first, I'm going to talk about the role of admixture in canid evolutionary relationships. As you can see from this graph, I have an anecdote about this particular tree. The first time I got into canid evolution was back in 2014, and there were two complementary hypotheses about where the dog was domesticated. The Chinese group said it was domesticated in China. The European group said it was domesticated in the Middle East, Europe. I made my first tree and it was domesticated in Denmark. So the beauty of domestication of the wolf lies in the eye of the beholder. And the better part of it was when I looked at the tree carefully, the basal wolf was an Indian wolf. That made my day, but it's been all downhill since then. The second part of what I'm going to talk about today is the role of admixture and adaptation. And this is a little bit more of a tricky subject because although there is plenty of anecdotal evidence of gene flow between dogs and wolves, wolves and jackals, and all kinds of canids, it's been very difficult, at least for our lab, to be able to narrow down a particular trait or a particular set of genes where we can point out to stuff and say, you know what, this is how it happened, and introgression or admixture played a big role in it. I'm going to give you a couple of examples later today, but this is an active area of research, and many people, including me, are working on it at the University of Copenhagen. So how did it all begin? It began in Greenland. As with most things in Denmark, whenever we want to look for some natural research, we look to Greenland. There's not too many things in Denmark. So we were looking at the Greenlandic sled dogs, and the major question that was being asked was, can we better understand how these Greenlandic sled dogs evolved to live in Greenland and how they evolved to be such wonderful draft animals, right? And it was inspired by a paper from Pontus Kålund in 2015, where they showed that some breeds of Arctic dogs, and especially only Arctic dogs, show this evidence of admixture of ancestry from this wolf which went extinct about 10 to 20,000 years ago, called the Pleistocene wolf, a sample of which they had dating back to 35,000 years ago. And so this is what the tree looked like, and we said, you know what, we don't have much else, but we have some Greenland sled dogs, so let's throw this machinery at it and see what happens. So this enthusiastic student from the group went at that point to Greenland. You can see it's not a pleasant stay up there. Spent risked his limb and life and collected DNA from 10 dogs from Greenland, and there was nothing. That big black box you see in the middle is Greenlandic sled dogs. No matter what wolf we threw at it, it's like, no thank you, right? So was this the end of admixture? Well, maybe, but during this period of time, we were quite inspired by work that Ludovic was doing in the lab in Copenhagen as well. And one of the observations Ludovic had was it's quite important when you're doing any of these works trying to tease apart differences between closely related species to have the right reference genome and the right resources to be able to ask the questions. And dogs and wolves are very closely related. Although we still can't tell where they come from, they're pretty closely related, right? So we were lucky enough, not for the wolf, but for us, we were lucky enough there was a sample from Sweden, which was recently shot. So we used this sample to collect, make a reference genome, and then basically the result of that was there is not too much of a difference between what genome you use. But in this process of getting a reference genome for this new wolf, and then collecting samples from everywhere, now we had a compendium of samples from across Africa and across Europe, which we could now ask questions on about admixture, gene flow, how that affects the canid relationships, how any kind of adaptive integration might be going on in canids. With that, I will get into the bulk of the talk today. The admixture is absolutely pervasive in canids. And this should come as no surprise to anybody here who's seen a dog behave, right? So they're not very particular. And so I'm going to talk about 3 different cases where admixture has given rise to either retaining some ancestry of lost lineages or of hybrid speciation. Although I'm not entirely sold, I would not call it hybrid speciation, but to make it sound a little bit better, hybrid speciation, right? And as you can see here, one of them, the top one, I'm going to first talk about the African golden wolf, which is a recently nominated species. And then I'm going to talk about wolves from Japan and Sicily, right? And as you can see, if you think this is bad taxidermy, you should see some of the other pictures I have for the Japanese and Sicilian wolves. This is the best looking Sicilian wolf. And there's another picture where there are 7 people looking at it and trying to figure out how it's going. But I was like, what are you looking at? Anyway, but we were lucky enough to have some samples from both of these species. And thanks to people at museums who work hard to preserve them. Right. So first I'm going to talk about the African golden wolf. I am a canid person, but I could not tell you if this is an African golden wolf or a Eurasian golden jackal. To me, both of them look very similar. But some people with a keener eye than mine have noticed some morphological differences between the left and the right. The right is the Eurasian golden jackal, the left is the African golden wolf. And now this particular species has been nominated as a new species, has been minted as a new species in the last 5 to 7 years. And the momentum for nominating it as a different species and thus putting efforts into its conservation in Africa have been on the rise. This is the map showing the distribution of the various canids in the world, and the part that's demarcated in light blue in Africa is the range of the African golden wolf. And you can clearly see it covers an enormous part of the continent and is found across its entire range. So there are not any particular areas within its range where you might not be able to find them. And before they were given their own species designation, they were considered to be the same species as the golden jackals, whose range here is marked in darker blue/purple, depending on whether it overlaps with the range of the golden wolf or not. So after they were designated their own species, or rather in 2015, Copley et al. Had a particular paper where they collected mitochondrial DNA from samples of African golden wolves across the range of Africa and the Eurasian golden jackal, and they came up with this theory or this suggestion that we should nominate the species to be a species of its own, the African golden wolf to be a species of its own. And if you look carefully at some of their results, we can see when we're looking at African golden jackals, there are definitely 2 clades of African golden jackals, which seem to be clustered around either the east in Kenya or the west and northeast in the Middle East, close to Israel and Morocco. And we followed up this work, and we tried to follow up work using a few samples that we had collected on our own. And then when we tried to figure out whether the eastern and the northwestern populations of African golden wolves are different, we figured that the eastern population of the African golden wolf, I'm going to call them AGW from now on, because African golden wolf is making my mouth dry. Right? So AGWs, when we're looking at the eastern population of AGWs, those from Kenya and those from Tanzania, we see that they carry a lot more of the Ethiopian wolf variation, rather than the western populations of the same species. Right? Conversely, when we look at the western half of the continent, so Morocco and other places in the west, so I think we have samples from Algeria and Libya as well, we see that they carry a lot more ancestry from gray wolves. So we tried to model all of this ancestry into a single graph, which would let us explain what this species looks like. And we started off with a graph where we had a basal graph for just the coyotes and Ethiopian wolves and gray wolves. But then we started introducing the 2 populations of the African golden wolves. And both of these populations can be best modeled as a mixture between Ethiopian wolves and gray wolves with subsequent ancestry from either the gray wolf or the Ethiopian wolf, depending on which part of the continent you might be in. So clearly, admixture has played quite a predominant role in defining what the genetics of this species is. And we propose that most likely this species is arising due to the confluence of 3 different species coming together: the golden jackal from Eurasia, the Ethiopian wolf, and the gray wolf from Eurasia as well. So with this, this was one of the stories that we found when we were looking at the relationships between the various basal canids. But one thing that I've understood and learned from looking at canids is if you ever try to model your canids as a tree, and for that matter, any population now, any set of species or populations now, given the evidence for admixture is becoming overwhelming, is you better be ready to draw a lot of arrows. Right? So we have lots of admixture between lots of the basal groups that we have here, also groups that date back, whose divergence dates back about 2 million years ago, which is African hunting dogs and dholes, and we see evidence of gene flow between them. There are some particular species which I haven't shown here, where work on those species was done after this particular paper was published, where we have some samples about from the island of Sardinia, which is called the Sardinian dhole, which is the sister species to the Eurasian dhole, and we see evidence of admixture in that as well. So any sample we get from anywhere in the world, we can throw it into this tree, but you've got to draw admixture arrows. There is no way that we can explain the genetics of any species as being standalone. So that was the first foray into how to understand basal canid relationships. For the next 2 parts of this talk, I'm going to talk about wolves in particular wolves that have been extinct for only the last 100 or so years. And both of these wolves I'm going to talk about, Japanese wolves and Sicilian wolves, share this distinction of living on islands, isolated for a long period of time. And you will see that one of the patterns we see in both of them, I'm going to give away the punchline here, is that both these species, before their extinction, harbored quite a lot of dog ancestry in them. And in the case of Sicilian wolf, I'll retain at least some of the thunder for when I talk about it. It has quite exciting ancestry lineages it's retaining from back 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So anyway, talking about Japanese wolf is made up of 2 subspecies, the Ezo wolf or the Hokkaido wolf, which is basically inhabited the islands of Hokkaido and Sakhalin, and the Honshu wolf, which inhabited the main island of Honshu and the southern islands of Shikoku and Kyushu. The important thing to note here is that although Hokkaido and Honshu are fairly close by, it's impossible for a wolf to cross the strait because the strait is fairly deep. And the other thing to note is that no matter how cold it got, the sea between Honshu and mainland Asia never froze over. So it was very difficult, it seldom froze over, so it's very difficult to expect gene flow from the mainland and Honshu. Whereas the Sakhalin Island is fairly close to the mainland Asia, so when the seas froze over, there was quite a bit of migration over the sea ice between Sakhalin Island and Russia. So one of the things that we found is Honshu wolf, which looks like it's actually a relict population. Unlike all of the other wonderful admixture plots you saw today before, here you will see that we have only a handful of samples. Welcome to the wolf world. We don't have so many samples, but hopefully we are actually fixing that in the next few years. Anyway, so let me get into what our observation was. Here I'm talking about Siberian Pleistocene wolves, which are shown in red here. These are the wolves that went extinct about 12 to 20,000 years ago. And if you note to see where the affiliation of the Honshu wolf looks, it looks pretty much like it is one of the Siberian Pleistocene wolves. So a wolf which went extinct about 100 years ago due to human persecution, late 1930s was the last sighting of the Honshu wolf, carried lineage which looked very similar to the Siberian Pleistocene wolf, indicating that probably was a relict population. Right? And this pretty much shows a similar plot as well. Here I'm showing 2 forms of D statistics on the X and Y axis, indicating whether, replacing whether a hornshoe wolf or a Pleistocene wolf is placed in H3. And you will see that for most of the wolves, the signal falls right on the x equal to y line, indicating they're equally related to both of these. At least there is no extra evidence for genetic affinity to one or the other population, whereas there are some dogs, especially Japanese and Korean breed dogs, which tend to show higher affinity to Japanese wolves. Again, it's not terribly surprising. Right, so we followed this up with doing some analysis to see if we can figure out whether we can paint the chromosomes of, rather we use fine structure on the samples that we have. And here on the right-hand side, when you see the PCA, which is based on the results we have from the fine structure, again, you can see here that the Siberian Pleistocene wolves in red kind of separate out and cluster together with the Eurasian wolves, which are in blue, but the orange point there is the hornshoe wolf, which lies somewhere in between dogs and Siberian Pleistocene wolves. The reason why Siberian Pleistocene wolves are scattered across the range is because they come from about a 30,000-year-old time span, so they're not all completely homogeneous. And when we look at what is the major ancestry component that can explain the ancestry of the hornshoe wolf, you can see that it is actually the other wolves that are present in the data set. So our model for Japanese wolves is this simplified diagram that I show here on the left, where the hornshoe wolf is probably a relic population of the Siberian wolves, but in the last few centuries of having small population sizes and sharing the island of Honshu with other dogs, most likely this particular wolf mixed a lot with dogs, donating its ancestry to dogs at the same time, getting a lot of ancestry from dogs into its genome. We have a few more samples that are on the way, so I think we are going to get better story here about a better understanding at the very least about whether these wolves truly were a relic population, which I'm fairly convinced about, but also about when did they start mixing with other dogs on the island. The third story that I'm going to talk to you about is that of Sicilian wolves, and their story follows a remarkably good trajectory of, I can see some giggles. This is not the best sample, but it is taxidermically not the best, but genetically we got the most material out of this guy. So they share a remarkably similar story to that of the Japanese wolf, and it's only made more surprising by the fact that Sicily is not particularly far away from mainland Italy. So there is no reason to imagine why there would be a barrier between Italy and Sicily. But that was our finding. Just as a background for what Italian wolves look like, again, humans were very happy killing wolves up till about 1970 in Europe, at which point suddenly there was some conservation efforts that kicked in, and which allowed wolves to spread back out again. And Italian wolves have been remarkably successful. In the last 30-odd years, they've spread out from the Apennines, which were basically where they were placed, now to colonize pretty much all of Italy and parts of the Alps, and now moving into France as well. But the Sicilian wolves, when you try to compare the Sicilian wolves to the Italian wolves, and these Italian wolves are modern Italian wolves after they spread across the rest of Italy, the Sicilian wolves look quite different. The Sicilian wolves here are marked in blue on top. These PCA plots, these MDS plots have dogs as well in them, and so the first dimension separates out the dogs from the wolves. But when you look across the spread of these different wolves on the y-axis, you can see that the Sicilian wolves are quite distinct from other wolves. And the closest relative to the Sicilian wolf is the Italian wolves, marked there in that brown color. And even when we focus only on the Sicilian wolves, only on the wolf populations, we can see again that the Sicilian wolves are quite distinct from all of the other wolf populations that we have, including the Chinese highland wolves, which are a story of their own. Come and talk to me if you're interested in it. It's a weird story. So when we looked at some admixture plots to see what these Sicilian wolves look like, before they start showing being assigned to a cluster of their own, one of the things that was noticeable in them is, besides their affinity to Italian and other Eurasian wolves, they did harbor some affinity to dogs as well. So we decided to explore this a little bit further. And when we looked to see whether Okay, I can't see the lines very clearly here, so let me just tell you what the story is here. The story here is that when we look to see the later versus the earlier sample of Sicilian wolves, so we have these samples span around 100 years in time. So the latest sample of Sicilian wolves, we actually see a higher amount of dog ancestry in them. And this dog ancestry does not come from modern Eurasian dogs, but comes from Bronze Age Italian and Croatian dogs. So these do not represent dogs that we see today in Europe, but they do not represent breed dogs either. But these Sicilian wolves have been harboring the lineages that they came in contact with 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and they've been maintaining this ancestry in them. Our hypothesis is as time went by and this population in Sicily started dwindling, they started, for some reason or other, some of these ancestry proportions got magnified. I don't have a real clear answer as to why. So this is our model for what the Sicilian wolves look like. They harbor ancestry from ancient dogs in Europe, as you can see there. And they harbor, as you can see here, they have about 50-50 ancestry between that of ancient dogs and that of other Eurasian wolves. Now I want to spend about 3 minutes talking about admixture and adaptation in the world of canids. The world of canids, like I said, admixture and adaptation, it's quite difficult to find clear evidence of admixture leading to adaptive advantages in canids. But one such example, which was published a few years ago by Bob Wayne and colleagues in the US, was that of the black coat color. So in the US and Canada, wolves do not have the black coat color. It's dogs which have the black coat color. And this particular locus, called the K locus, introgressed into wolves in Canada, giving them the black coat color. And the black coat color is advantageous because it prevents distemper and mange in these wolves, so they can better prevent some of the diseases of the skin that they are exposed to. But at the same time, there's a cost to be paid here. Black coat color leads to worse mate choice among these wolves. So they don't tend to get picked, so they have fewer offspring. But for some reason, the black coat color has made it to be the more frequent coat color in Canada. The other example that I wanted to talk about was parasite resistance in African dogs. This was a work in which we were involved to a minor extent, where a number of African dogs were sequenced in an effort led by Guodong Wang at the Kunming Institute of Zoology. And together with these African dogs, they compared African golden wolves. And they found when the African golden wolves, these dogs were quite in a clade of their own, not showing too much evidence of admixture from African golden wolves. But they found that in recent times, around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, there was quite a wave of admixture from the African golden wolves into the Nigerian dogs. And specifically, when they looked at one particular variant of the gene ADGRE1, which is found, they found differences in European and African dogs, and the African version of the dogs led to a higher immune response on exposure to the malaria parasite. And this is pretty similar to the same kind of signals that we see in humans as well. And with that, I would like to end by showing you this picture again. Anytime you think that model organisms like dogs or non-model organisms like dogs are fun to get into, let this be a warning sign for you. I got into this imagining life would be rosy. It has been quite a challenge disentangling all their genetics for the last few years, but it has been fun. And I would like to thank, this work is obviously done by a lot of other people. I'm just speaking on their behalf. So the top row of people have all contributed in various amounts to the different studies that I talked about. And as always, thanks to all the funding agencies and the sample providers without whom this work would have been impossible. And I would like to say also thank to Tom, who's leading the effort on the Norwegian wolf sequencing along with me. And with that, I'll take any questions.